Trump called Canadian oil trash. He said it out loud, on record, with the confidence of a man who believed Canada had nowhere else to go. He was wrong, because while he was busy insulting one of America's closest allies, Canada's new Prime Minister Mark Carney was already on a plane, and the destination was not Washington. If you are watching the news right now and you feel like something shifted, something cracked open in the architecture of the world you thought you understood, you are not imagining it. The relationship between the United States and Canada, the longest undefended border on Earth, the most integrated economic partnership in the history of the modern world, is fracturing in real time. Not slowly, not quietly. It is fracturing loudly, publicly, and with consequences that will land in your fuel tank, your grocery bill, and your country standing on the global stage for decades to come. You need to understand what is happening here, not the version they will give you in a 30-second clip. The full version. The version that connects the insult to the consequence, the arrogance to the aftermath, and the moment Donald Trump dismissed Canadian oil as worthless to the moment Canada decided that maybe America wasn't so indispensable after all. This is that story, and once you hear it, you will not be able to unhear it. To understand how we got here, you have to go back, not just to last year, not just to the first Trump administration. You have to go back to the foundational assumption that has governed North American politics and economics since the end of World War II. The assumption was simple, almost childlike in its simplicity. The United States and Canada are partners. Full stop. Not competitors. Not adversaries. Partners. They share a border that stretches nearly 9,000 kilometers. They share a trade relationship worth over $800 billion annually. They share military infrastructure through NATO and NORAD. They share intelligence through the Five Eyes Alliance. For generations, the operating principle was that whatever disagreements arose, and there were always disagreements, they would be resolved inside the family, quietly, diplomatically, because the alternative was unthinkable. That assumption is now being tested in ways that would have seemed like fiction 5 years ago. The specific flashpoint, the moment that crystallized everything, came when Donald Trump, in his characteristically blunt, characteristically unfiltered style, made comments dismissing Canadian oil and energy exports as essentially worthless to the United States. The framing shifted depending on the day and the platform, but the message was consistent. Canada needs us more than we need them. Their oil, their resources, their economy, all of it is dependent on American goodwill. And if Canada doesn't play by Washington's rules, then Washington can simply look elsewhere. This was not said in a private meeting. This was not a diplomatic back-channel communication. This was said with the full weight of the American presidency behind it, broadcast to the world, intended to project dominance and extract compliance. And for a moment, just a moment, it seemed like it might work. It did not work. Now let's talk about the men at the center of this collision, because this story only makes sense when you understand who these people are, what they believe, and what they are each willing to do. Donald Trump came back to the White House in January 2025 with a mandate he interpreted as absolute. His second term began not with the cautious triangulation of a man who had learned from his first term's chaos, but with the aggressive, unilateral energy of someone who believed the rules had changed because he had changed them. Trump has always operated from a transactional worldview. Every relationship, every alliance, every treaty is a deal. And in every deal, there is a winner and a loser. By the time he returned to power, he had decided that America had been losing too many deals for too long. Canada, in Trump's framing, was one of the countries that had been taking advantage, running a trade surplus with the United States in certain sectors, maintaining supply chains that Trump believed should be purely domestic, and, most provocatively, sitting on some of the largest oil reserves in the world while continuing to export them to America at prices and on terms that Trump found politically inconvenient. Trump's weapon of choice in this confrontation was tariffs. Beginning in early 2025, the administration moved to impose sweeping tariffs on Canadian goods, including a 25% tariff on most Canadian imports. The stated justification shifted. Sometimes it was about fentanyl crossing the border. Sometimes it was about trade imbalances. Sometimes it was about Canada not spending enough on defense. But the underlying message never changed. Fall in line, or pay the price. Mark Carney is a different kind of man entirely, and that difference matters enormously to this story. Carney did not grow up in politics. He grew up in economics, specifically in the highest chambers of global finance. He holds degrees from Harvard and Oxford. He served as the governor of the Bank of Canada during the 2008 financial crisis, and his steady, precise management of that catastrophe earned him a reputation as one of the most capable central bankers in the world. Then Britain came calling. He became governor of the Bank of England, the first non-British person ever to hold that position, and guided the United Kingdom through the turbulence of Brexit. He knows what economic warfare looks like. He has sat across tables from the most powerful financial institutions in the world. He has navigated sovereign debt crises, currency collapses, and political upheavals that would have destroyed lesser men. And then, in early 2025, he stepped into the most unexpected role of his career. With Justin Trudeau's resignation following his own Liberal Party's political crisis, Carney emerged as Liberal leader and subsequently became Prime Minister of Canada. He entered the role at the precise moment that Trump's tariff offensive was accelerating, and unlike his predecessor, Carney did not respond with hope. He responded with strategy. This is the man Trump decided to call weak. This is the country Trump decided to call economically inferior. This is the oil Trump decided to call trash. Let's talk about that oil. Because if you do not understand what Canadian oil actually represents in the global energy market, you cannot understand the scale of the miscalculation that was just made. Canada is the fourth largest oil producer in the world. Its proven oil reserves sit at approximately 170 billion barrels, the third largest proven reserves on the planet, behind only Venezuela and Saudi Arabia. The vast majority of that oil comes from the Alberta oil sands, a geological formation so vast and so energy-rich that it has been described by energy economists as one of the most significant hydrocarbon deposits in human history. Canadian oil currently exports approximately 4 million barrels per day. Approximately 97% of those exports flow south, into the United States, into American refineries, into American gas tanks. When Trump called that oil trash, he was not speaking about a marginal commodity. He was speaking about the lifeblood of the Midwestern American refining system. The refineries in Illinois, Michigan, Ohio, and Minnesota were specifically built to process heavy crude, the kind of crude that comes from Alberta. They cannot easily switch to lighter crude from the Middle East or Texas without billions of dollars in retrofitting costs. The supply chain dependency runs so deep that some American energy analysts have estimated it would take years and hundreds of billions of dollars to meaningfully replace Canadian oil in the American system. Trump knew this, or he should have known this. And yet the insult came anyway. What happened next is where this story turns from a trade dispute into a geopolitical earthquake. Mark Carney did not hold a press conference and cry. He did not write a strongly worded letter to the American ambassador. He did not call Trump and beg for a meeting. He picked up the phone and called Narendra Modi. India, the world's most populous country, the world's fastest growing major economy, a nation that has been consuming energy at a rate that has made it one of the most aggressive importers of oil on the planet. A country that has spent the better part of the last decade positioning itself as a global economic power not aligned exclusively with Western institutions. A country that wants resources, wants partnerships, and wants to diversify away from dependency on Middle Eastern oil. In early 2025, as Trump's tariff war against Canada intensified, Carney traveled to India. The optics alone were seismic. A Canadian prime minister, in the middle of a confrontation with Washington, flying to New Delhi to deepen economic ties with the world's most consequential emerging market. The meetings with Modi were reported to cover energy cooperation, critical minerals, trade corridors, and the framework for a new kind of partnership, one that explicitly did not require American approval or American participation. Canada and India have not always had a smooth relationship. There have been serious diplomatic tensions, including the 2023 crisis over the killing of Sikh activist Hardeep Singh Nijjar on Canadian soil, which Ottawa publicly attributed to Indian government agents, a claim that New Delhi denied. That rupture was real. The mistrust was real. And yet here were Carney and Modi sitting across from each other, because the logic of geopolitics is ruthless. It does not care about yesterday's grievances when today's opportunity is this large. Canada was not just shopping for a new customer for its oil. Canada was building an exit from American economic dominance. The energy trade discussions between Canada and India were part of a broader reorientation that Carney had been quietly architecting since the moment he took office. He began pursuing free trade agreement negotiations with the European Union with renewed urgency. He accelerated conversations with Southeast Asian economies under the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership. He visited allies and partners in a deliberate sequence that sent a message Washington could not misread. Canada has options. Canada has always had options, and Canada is now prepared to use them. This is what happens when you back a sophisticated nation into a corner. It does not fold. It pivots. And the pivot Canada is making is not a minor adjustment. It is a fundamental restructuring of where the country sees its future. For generations, Canadian economic policy operated on a single unspoken axiom, that the United States was not just the primary partner, but the necessary partner, the irreplaceable partner, the partner that Canada could never afford to alienate because there was simply nowhere else to go. Trump's tariff offensive shattered that axiom, not because Canada was devastated, though there was real economic pain, but because it forced a reckoning. It forced Canadian leaders, Canadian businesses, and the Canadian public to ask a question they had never seriously had to ask before. What if we didn't need them as much as we thought? The answer, it turns out, is bracing. Canada's critical minerals sector alone, lithium, cobalt, nickel, copper, the building blocks of the electric vehicle revolution and the clean energy transition, gives Canada leverage in a world scrambling to secure supply chains independent of Chinese dominance. India wants those minerals. Europe wants those minerals. Japan, South Korea, and Australia want those minerals. The demand exists. The supply exists. What was missing was the political will to redirect it. Trump provided that political will by making the cost of American dependency visible in a way that no diplomatic argument ever could. Follow the money now, because this is where the story becomes personal for every American watching. If Canada successfully redirects even a fraction of its oil exports away from the United States toward Asia and Europe, American refineries face a supply crunch. The Gulf Coast has its own production, but the Midwest, the industrial heartland of America, depends on Canadian heavy crude in ways that cannot be quickly substituted. Energy price shocks in the Midwest translate directly into manufacturing costs, transportation costs, and ultimately consumer prices. The people who heat their homes with fuel oil in Michigan and Minnesota, the people who fill their tanks in Ohio, the people who work in industries that run on energy in Wisconsin and Indiana, they are the ones who pay the price when the supply chain gets disrupted. Not Wall Street, not Washington, you. And that is before you account for the retaliatory tariffs Canada has already imposed on American goods. Canada's counter tariffs target American steel, aluminum, agricultural products, and consumer goods. A carefully calibrated list designed to inflict maximum political pain in maximum number of American congressional districts. American farmers who sell into the Canadian market are already feeling it. American manufacturers who depend on Canadian steel and aluminum inputs are already restructuring their supply chains at enormous cost. The blowback from this trade war is not abstract. It is landing on real people in real places right now. Here is the deeper truth that the mainstream conversation keeps dancing around without ever quite saying directly. What Trump did to Canada was not just bad trade policy. It was an act of economic aggression against a sovereign ally. And the framing that Canada is simply a smaller, weaker neighbor that should accept its subordinate status, that framing reveals something important about the ideology driving American foreign policy in this moment. It reveals a belief that power justifies everything. That size determines worth. That nations without nuclear weapons and standing armies are simply raw material to be processed by the great powers that surround them. Canada rejected that framing. And the way it rejected that framing, not with bluster, not with threats, but with a quiet, methodical construction of alternatives, is a masterclass in how middle powers survive and eventually thrive in a world dominated by giants. But there is something else happening here that goes beyond Canada and beyond energy. What you are watching is the acceleration of a trend that has been building for years, the slow unraveling of the American-led global order that has structured international relations since 1945. Every time the United States uses its economic power as a weapon against allies rather than adversaries, it teaches those allies a lesson. It teaches them to hedge. It teaches them to build redundancy. It teaches them to find other partners. And every time that lesson is taught and learned, America's network of trust shrinks a little more. The dominoes fall slowly, and then all at once. Canada is not the first American ally to begin hedging. Europe has been quietly working to reduce its dependence on American military and financial systems since Trump's first term. Japan and South Korea have been watching American reliability in Asia with increasing concern. Australia is deepening ties with neighbors that would have seemed unlikely partners a decade ago. The pattern is consistent. And the pattern points toward a world in which American leadership is no longer assumed, no longer automatic, no longer something that allies simply accept as the default condition of global order. That world is coming. Trump's treatment of Canada is not causing it, it is accelerating it. And the acceleration is now fast enough that the consequences will be felt not in 30 years, but in 30 months. So what happens next? Let's walk through it. In the near term, the next 30 to 60 days, the most important variable is whether the Canada-India energy framework produces a concrete agreement. If Carney returns from New Delhi with a signed memorandum of understanding on oil exports, critical minerals, or infrastructure investment, the signal to Washington will be unmistakable. Canada is not bluffing. The pipeline of alternatives is real, and it is being built. That signal alone will shift the bargaining dynamic between Ottawa and Washington in ways that months of diplomatic protest could not achieve. In the medium term, 3 to 6 months, watch for Canada to accelerate its free trade negotiations with Europe. If Canada secures a meaningful expansion of CETA, the Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreement with the European Union, it opens a massive alternative market for Canadian energy and manufactured goods. It also gives Canadian businesses the certainty they need to begin the long process of restructuring away from American dependency. That restructuring, once it begins in earnest, becomes very difficult to reverse. In the worst-case scenario, and this is the scenario that should make every American uncomfortable, Canada succeeds in redirecting 15 to 20% of its oil exports to non-American markets over the next 3 to 5 years. On paper, that sounds manageable. In practice, for the Midwest refining system, it is catastrophic. Energy prices spike. Manufacturing costs rise. Jobs in industrial communities that are already fragile take another hit. And the political fallout, the search for someone to blame, becomes the fuel for another cycle of rage and reaction that further destabilizes American domestic politics. The worst case is not a war. It is a slow-motion impoverishment of the American middle class driven by a trade policy built on insults instead of strategy. In the best-case scenario, and this requires a significant course correction from Washington, the Trump administration recognizes that Canada's response is not weakness and not theater. It is serious, it is sustained, and it is working. In this scenario, back-channel negotiations produce a new framework that gives Canada meaningful relief from the harshest tariffs in exchange for guaranteed energy supply commitments and a renegotiation of certain trade terms. It is not a clean win for either side, but it is a de-escalation. And de-escalation, at this point, would be a victory for every person on both sides of that border who is already paying the price for a fight that neither of them chose. The question is whether anyone in Washington is capable of making that course correction. And the honest answer is, it is not clear. Here is what you need to carry with you from everything you have just heard. The world operates on relationships, not just trade relationships, not just military alliances, but the deeper, harder to measure relationships of trust, respect, and shared interest. Those relationships took generations to build. They are not rebuilt in a press conference or a phone call. When you call your neighbor's livelihood trash, when you publicly humiliate a partner, dismiss their contribution, and treat their sovereignty as an inconvenience, you do not just damage a bilateral relationship. You damage your own credibility with every other country watching. And they are all watching. Canada did not start this fight. Canada tried for months to manage this diplomatically, to find workarounds, to protect the relationship. Mark Carney came to power not as a radical, but as a pragmatist, a man whose entire career has been built on finding workable solutions to impossible problems. What drove him to New Delhi was not ideology. It was necessity. And when a country with Canada's resources, Canada's intelligence capacity, Canada's seat at every major international institution, concludes that it must build its future without defaulting to American partnership, that is not a minor diplomatic incident. That is a structural shift in the architecture of the world. You are living inside that shift right now. The question is not whether Canada can survive without American dominance. Canada is already proving that it can. The question is whether America can afford the world it is creating, a world where its closest allies are quietly, methodically, irreversibly building the infrastructure to leave. Trump called Canadian oil trash. Canada responded by going to find someone who understood its value, and the rest of the world took notes. So here is what I want you to think about, and what I want you to tell me in the comments below. If the United States continues on this path, using its economic weight to bully allies rather than lead them, at what point does America's network of trusted partners become too small to matter? At what point does the insult become the isolation? At what point does the most powerful nation on earth wake up and realize that power without allies is just a very expensive way to be alone? Tell me what you think, because this conversation is just getting started.